Hello and welcome to another Persevere and Motivate video. As of yesterday, we discussed about this PM role, so we started explaining about how this would work, and now in this video we're actually going to put it into practice and start actually building the user interfaces to represent these data objects. Just a confession, just to pre-warn you, I'm a little on the tired side, so just bear with me going through this video. I might pause for excuse me, I might pause every so often perhaps. I mean, it's kind of natural in my voice also, but pause for perhaps a little longer. I'll try my best to edit it out. Now let's go ahead then and begin immediately, because I don't really want to dabble on this too much. I've explained most of this pretty much yesterday. There is also the training material stuff that I will do at some point, but I'm going to do that in a separate video because that's going to involve more to do with uploading files to the server, which would in fact require a REST API. Because we're going to be using PHP and actually sending files through the server side code, which would involve some hacks coding. So I'm not going to do that until a bit later. You're probably wondering, well, why don't you use FTP? Well, for starters, FTP can be a bit nuanced in certain respects, and it's also, I mean, unless you're using a secure channel, it's actually not very secure at all. It's good for uploading websites and stuff, but to use it just as a solution for uploading single files every now and again I don't think is ideal. I think putting it through an actual server is probably the better way to do it, at least in my opinion. I'm sure there are perhaps people who can correct me on that, but maybe it's just my personal bias against FTP for whatever reason. I've had some bad experiences with FTP in the past. Let's just say that. But anyway, let's just build this user interface without dabbling and ranting on things that I don't really fully understand. So let's go down here now. I'm thinking that, so here's my thought process before I started this video. That the thought process was I could either do it in here, the form, having it generated, but then I thought, well, this is quite complex. It probably requires more of a specific user interface, so I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to use the form builder in this instance due to the complexity of this role, and there will be a variety of complex situations. We can perhaps simplify some of those complex situations by putting some of it in here, and in fact I will be using, for example, set field, get field, and set ID reference list, which we will use to simplify some of the processes. For example, this set field method assigns all of the relevant event handling for when values change, and it sets the respective values for the instance of the database object, right? And it only does it on simple controls like combo boxes, date time picker, numeric up down, that sort of thing, right? And with get filled, it's the case of simply getting the value from the database object and setting it to the control that we pass in. And that's just a very simple. I mean, it basically does all of this tedious work that we would otherwise have to do without this class. So this is why this class exists, primarily around this get filled and this set filled. The filled multiline, this filled, end section, begin section, that's all relatively new, which is what I was saying yesterday, it's not quite complete yet. And even this begin search, I mean, I haven't even done anything on this yet. So eventually this will be fleshed out and brought to a point where it will in fact be complete and released as part of an open source project, perhaps with DBM as well. And I might combine them, I'm not sure yet. In fact, I probably will combine them because they both rely on each other anyway. Well, no, that's not correct. GUI forms is dependent on DBM, so you know. But anyway, let's go in here and start building our roles form. It's the actual roles form where we actually look up the roles themselves. It's just going to be fairly simple, kind of like this departments form here. It's just going to be like this, or at least similar anyway. The search functionality is going to be, well, limited for the time being. You probably saw in the previous video, we've got this analytics thing here. We're not going to touch that until much later on. Once we've got all of the, oops, wasn't meant to do that. Once we've got all of the data in place, like say the candidates and the employees, that sort of thing, then we can actually start thinking about implementing analytics and start adding test data in order to make sure that analytics section works. So we would be drawing charts using GDI plus, maybe adding some animations here and there just to make it a little bit more fancy perhaps, but you know, that sort of thing. And yes, I am aware that the Windows, what is it, Power Pack for Visual Basic does include things like charts and stuff, but I think it's probably better to just build it myself, primarily because it's an opportunity to learn, primarily, and also I don't like the idea of consistently using all of the native inbuilt functionality of the .NET framework. It's good to be able to, you know, build from scratch and know the code yourself so that you can improve on it later. So that's the main reason to use that. But without dabbling on that bit too much, let's actually start designing this form. So I'm just going to set some default parameters over here. It's not going to be sizable. Actually, what am I doing? I would like to minimize, and I would also like the show and taskbar and show icon. It's not actually going to be a dialogue. This should be fixed single, technically. So, okay. I'm looking for a button. It's up here. Why was I looking down there for? I have no idea. So, very simple. New role. Now, in the previous, I'm going to get rid of that. In the previous form here, departments, we just have a list box. We're going to have the same, but we're also going to be able to filter on a per department basis. And in fact, why am I even dragging that? I can just copy that, paste in here. Why not? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put in a combo box here. That's going to be department. It's going to be a drop down list because we don't want to add anything to it or edit at runtime. And I'm just going to leave it blank because we'll code it in. I'm going to put a label next to it. You can see why I enjoy WinForms most. You have a lot more control over where you can locate things versus WPF. Things that force you to use all of these flow controls and stuff like that, it just doesn't make any sense to me. It really doesn't. I like to have control over how I position things, which is why I just love WinForms so much. Just have so much more freedom in this environment. And it doesn't force you to use stupid XAML files. I mean, I get the MVC approach or MVVM, but I just don't. I don't buy into it. I just don't like that approach. It doesn't work with my brain. I prefer procedural programming these days. I mean, I don't mind WinForms because a lot of the object-oriented programming that happens in WinForms is kind of concealed by the fact that it auto-generates most of it for you. So you don't have to put up with all the tediousness of instantiating objects all the time, which is why I enjoy this environment. But in frameworks where you have to instantiate absolutely everything with absolutely no editor in mind, it's hard for me to buy into it, you know. But anyway, so that's going to be a btn new role. This is going to be a btn edit. Now, there's going to be different stages for roles, as you can imagine. So there will be an analytics button for sure, but 2 seconds, btn analytics. And in fact, now that I think about it, I'll just finish this minute. I just thought, I was thinking as I was coming back home earlier, I need to go back in here, and I'm going to add 2 new variables. So I'm going to have employee ID here. So this is going to be automatically generated by the candidate who signs up and submits their application. So when they submit their application, what will happen is that will produce a candidate profile, which will eventually become an active employee if you recruit that candidate, right? And then when you recruit that candidate for the role, this specific, any given role, it will then assign the ID of that candidate to this employee ID here. And the next thing I want to do is visible. And that will obviously determine whether or not the role is actually visible for people on the vacancy template website to actually apply for that role. And we'll talk about applications later. We're not at that stage yet, so we're not going to talk about that too much. So let's go back here, and the how should I do this? So here's my thought process. The edit role could just take us to the actual role editing form, which we're going to design very shortly. Alternatively, I could have a separate form that determines based on the stage that the role is at, whether it's a candidate stage or interview stage, that we have a separate form that shows us information regarding that stage and then editing it based on that. Or alternatively, I could just have a drop down. Decisions. I'll think about that after this video. For now, let's just continue and actually just create the actual development, the role form. Before I go ahead and do that, let's populate our drop-down list. So what I'm going to do is say private void populate departments. So as usual, I'm using common.data and dbm. I'm going to call that here. I'm also going to say dbObject.initialize. So you might think this is quite tedious, having to do this all the time. It can be, but as I mentioned in the As I mentioned in the previous video, or one of the previous videos, the reason for this approach is for security reasons, and there will be trade-offs, obviously. And this is one of the trade-offs, having to duplicate code like this all the time in each of these different scenarios, whether it's the roles form or the departments form, whatever it might be. And even though they're part of the same application, they're still technically being launched as a separate application. Whether that's a good idea in practice, I have no idea. But we'll find that out in time, I suppose. So, what I'd now like to do is create a list of PM department containing our departments. That is going to be dbObjects search PM department, and we've got no filter because we want to get all of them. We're going to do, well, firstly, we're going to do cmb department.items.clear, and the next thing I'm going to do is iterate over the departments and add this department title. Finally, I'm going to go back here, double click on this, copy that. I'm going to say role here. And last but not least, I need to make sure that actually launches properly. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to copy this condition, change that to role, and then roles form. So I'm going to build that just to make sure it copies the files correctly. And let's just double check. Roles. Taking a while to launch. It's not in there. That do anything. Huh. Let's try that again. Is it actually launching? What's going on? In fact, actually, you know what? I need to get rid of that. No, it's still not working. What the hell? It's not even coming up with that error message there. Something's going on here. I'm going to put roll here. And then just debug this one. So launch is roll. And then we launch. Oh. I need to. That's the problem. That's the problem. I need to launch WAMP. That's what the problem was. I should I really do not like try-catch blocks, but it seems to be the only choice. Just to say, look, we couldn't connect to the database. Seriously, people, what is it with people's obsession with exceptions? It doesn't make my life easy, it really doesn't. I mean, having to wrap everything in try-catch blocks just because of exceptions is just ridiculous, honestly. Why can't we just have a Boolean value that determines whether that was successful or not? How hard is that, you know? But people are just so obsessed with object-oriented paradigm that they think that exceptions are cool and interesting. And while it sounds good in theory, what ends up happening is it makes programmers like me extremely annoyed. Everyone's fired. Nevertheless, I'm sure that will work now. Let's get rid of that. Let's now go back to launcher, start. All I want to do is make sure that it launches and we get our development department. That proves without a shadow of a doubt I am quite tired. Let's go back here. Department, I was meant to say there, not development. How the hell did I do that? Without noticing. Strange. Tiredness, folks. Don't stay awake all night. I'm trying to get back into a decent sleeping routine, so whatever. Anyway, so we've got this far, it's all good. Now we can actually start building this role UI. So let's go ahead and do that. Windows Forms, new role form. So in this new role form, I'm going to have a tab control. Show and taskbar. No. No. Minimize box. No. Don't want any of that. Fix dialogue. Okay. So, tab control. I'm going to fill that. This is going to be the general tab. This is going to be the contract info tab. So this will contain things like, let's see, our probation period, holidays, estimated salary, payment method, that sort of thing. So basic information is just going to be title, location, short description, and company description. And our requirements as well. So we'll have our requirements for the role up. This is where this one comes in. Role requirement. So we would have application or interview. This is what I was talking about yesterday. So we would have a scenario where it's either we're in application stage or interview stage, one of the two, and we would add a score to that. So let's go ahead and do that. We've got our contract info. We've got our training materials. So that would actually technically come before you start applying interview questions, but we'll like I said earlier, we'll work that out a little later when we start using hacks. This one is going to be interview questions. And finally, we're going to have a summary. And on the summary, we're just going to have an option to make it live, and then that would take us to the next stage, and then these tabs will change. In fact, yes, that sounds like a good idea, making the tabs change. So we'll probably still have the general information, the contract info, but the training, I'm going to start adding them now. So applications, this is the applications that you would receive. This tab would be not visible. Is there not an option to make tab pages visible? Invisible? Available? Whatever. Well, I thought that'd be an option. I never realized that. Okay. Well, never mind. Never mind. Yeah. Okay, now my thinking's changing. I still want to do the whole tab page visible invisible thing, but I think instead of dragging and dropping controls into here directly, we'll actually have components that we'll add. These will be in fact our tab page contents in here using user controls. So this will be our general tab. So we're just going to copy the size and paste it. Now, this does kind of complicate things because that means we have to pass different instances of PM role and role interview questions, requirements, scorecards, etc. all around. Can be a bit annoying sometimes. That's object-oriented programming languages for you. But yeah, we'll just have to deal with that. Talking about scorecards, I didn't actually add that, did I? Let's add scorecards. Scorecards. And in fact, that would be summary, and this would be scorecards. There. See? Okay. So we've got quite a few of them. So we've got our department IDs that we definitely need. We'll just drag that in around here. Where's our location? Let's just make let's just put it here. So department. So we're just gonna draw the UI really, and then we'll figure out all the programming later. This video will definitely have to be split, that's for sure. So it's the same as before. Basically, we're just going to get all of the departments and then we just select them. And this time I'm not going to call it development. Not going to call it development. Crucial mistake. We've got our title. We have our wait a minute, what? Where'd it go? Did I? Oh yeah. Silly. I was going to separate them just to make it obvious what section is what. So this is general, and everything after it is contract information. And in fact, that would be moved up here, like that. Let's combine those two. Okay, I'm not being stupid, honest. So I then want to add a short description of the role. This would appear also on the website. That needs to be multi-line. We want to add scroll bars. Might need to move that slightly. Description here. You're probably wondering, this isn't really you know, it's not locale friendly. I'm not obviously at that stage yet. This is all what you're seeing here is definitely not the final product, and especially when people might have different operating system UIs. I know there is an option to resize or make bigger UI within Windows, especially on much larger and higher resolutions, so that people can actually see things, funnily enough. So, you know, what you're seeing here with all this drag and drop into specific locations, I am aware of that limitation. It just, in my mind, that's a lot easier for me to do. Obviously, in the future, when we actually come to thinking about locale and you know, right to left writing for, say, different languages, and obviously also thinking about the fact that people can change the size of UI to also take that into consideration. So, you know, I mean, that's primarily one of the reasons why I have, you know, GUI forms. That's why I have this, to auto generate the UI. But as mentioned earlier, the trade-off is that I have to generalize quite a lot, and in more complex situations that's just not possible. You can't generalize a complex situation. If a complex situation is complex, there's nothing you can do about it. You know, so you have to work around that and find the trade-offs and figure out what to do with it. But anyway, let's see, where am I? Oh, we've got our location and company description. Okay, so I'm going to actually, let's just have another one, but over here. So this is going to be our location. TXT location, and we're just going to copy that over here as well, and that's going to be company. So about the company. Now this might actually be assigned to not just the database object, but also a global variable that can be saved locally automatically when you save the role, so that it automatically fills next time. I don't expect, although that being said, it could also be part of maybe global settings as part of the HR module, perhaps. Something to think about. Company description. So, you know, let's do it the old-fashioned way. So things to think about. Company description. How to store global variable. So how do we want to store it? Do we want to store it in a database or just as a saved file in the file system? The database option is probably the most obvious, really. We don't need that. Just randomly look there and think, no, don't need that. Okay. Getting up to 40 minutes now. We're going to continue this into a new video, so I'm just going to pause here and just start the next video immediately.